Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sherry Coleman and I teach 6th grade science at Hardin Valley Middle School. The printed handout that accompanies this video can be found on the KCS website under the Student Resources tab. This is the Week 4 activity packet for the week of April 27th. Today's activity is a review for 6th grade science. If you need a printed copy of this activity, they are going to be available at the meal distribution sites each week on Wednesdays between 10 and noon. I have a PowerPoint that I would like to show as we do our review today. So here's the first slide in the PowerPoint, and it's just going over the same information that I just spoke to you about. If you're having trouble with your video and it's hard for you to understand, there are 4 things that you can do to try to help fix the problem. The first one would be to turn on closed captions if that's available to you. Second, adjust the playback speed to slow down the video. Third, consider watching short clips, then pause, listen, and watch again. Fourth, ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and understood. What we're going to be reviewing today in our lesson is how climate affects the biotic and abiotic factors of an area. And we'll get into that a little bit more and review what those terms mean in science. Today's standard to master is 6.ls 2.4. Using evidence from climate data, draw conclusions about the patterns of abiotic and biotic factors in different land biomes. So our objective as we review today, by the end of class or by the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to say, I can analyze climate data and describe the biotic and abiotic factors for a particular climate. All the information that we're going to talk about today, you should have already learned earlier this year. Today's learning plan. First, we're going to review the basics about climate. Second, we'll analyze climograph data to make connections about 3 of the main Earth land biomes. Third, we'll conduct a task where we imagine living in another biome. And then finally, we'll have a short wrap-up and conclusion. So we'll start off with remembering about what biomes are. So they're large areas or regions that have similar plants, animals, geography, and climates. The world can be grouped into a number of distinct biomes, and you'll see in the picture to the right there, I showed desert biomes, and you'll see from the key there that the darker shaded areas, that's where we find our deserts on Earth. So we have 6 major land biomes on Earth, you may recall. The first is the desert biome, the second is tundra. Third, we have taiga, which can also be called the boreal forest or the coniferous forest. Fourth, we have the temperate deciduous forest. That's where we live in Knoxville. Next, we have the tropical rainforest. And last, we have grasslands and 2 distinct types of grasslands, which are savannas and temperate grasslands. Remember that our biotic factors, which are also called our living things, those biotic factors in an environment, they can often depend or can change according to abiotic or non-living factors. So abiotic factors include things like water and clouds and air and soils and rocks and sunlight, all of those things. Additionally, changes in body structures or behaviors, and these are called adaptations, they help plants and animals survive in their area. So if the environment changes rapidly, the organisms may need to leave the area or they'll die off. So I want to make sure that we differentiate between weather and climate. So remember that weather is what's happening in the atmosphere at a particular place and time, things like wind and temperature, air pressure, precipitation, and so on. So if we think about Knoxville weather for today, so that's a particular place, Knoxville, and a particular time today, we might say the weather is partly cloudy. High temperatures are going to be around 73 with the lows around 46. We might say we're expected to have about a half inch of rain later today, and that will be the weather for the Knoxville area. And then for climate is a little bit different because it's the long-term pattern of weather in a particular place. So the average weather that's happening. And so we might say the climate in Knoxville is we have moderate temperatures and rainy sessions usually found in the fall and spring. We might say summers are hot and humid, and then winters we have cold temperatures with moderate precipitation. So when we review our climographs, remember that climographs are graphs that show monthly average temperatures and precipitation for an area. And remember that precipitation is talking about rain, snow, sleet, or hail that falls to the ground in a particular location. So these climographs are wonderful because quickly you can see for an area what's happening in the climate with precipitation and temperature. We also call climographs climatographs. You may hear them called that, or climate graphs. So the plotted line usually represents temperature on your climograph, and the bars usually represent precipitation. So you will see that I copied this straight out of our science textbook for this slide, and I wrote at the top of the page. You can find this on page 327 in our online textbook. So this graphic to me really makes a clear representation of how two different types of graphs get combined together to make a climograph. So let's step through this quickly. So it says a graph of temperature can be combined with a graph of precipitation to form a climate graph. The graphs below show climate data for Makindu, Kenya. Look at the first graph. What's the average temperature in July? So if we look at, we're going to find July down here. These are the months of the year. So there's May, June, July. So we're just going to travel up here, and there is our data point for July. So the average temperature in July, if we follow that over to our axis label there, we find that that's going to be 20 degrees Celsius. Now it says, look at the second graph. What is the average precipitation in July? So we're looking at the axis label in blue now because we're looking at precipitation. And in July here, oh my goodness, it's really low, isn't it? Very close to that zero axis line. We would think that probably the average precipitation would be around 5 millimeters. And we're using millimeters and degrees Celsius as our SI units for these graphs. Look at the climate graph. How much rain does Makindu get in its hottest month? So now these two have been overlaid and combined together. And we have our temperature data in red. We have our precipitation data in blue. And what we'll have to do first is we'll have to look at what is the hottest month temperature. And what I do there is I follow this line along and I look at it and I see which one of these data points is the highest, the hottest on this line graph. And I see that this data point, this third data point, so that means it would be the third month, so January, February, March. So I find that that is the highest data point in temperatures as we move across for the year's worth of data. When I follow that along and I look then at the precipitation, so we're trying to find out how much rain that we have for what's the hottest month. And we found out that the hottest month is March. So now we're looking at that, and as I look, it's beyond and really close. It's about at the 3/4 mark. So if I look at the tick marks over on this axis here, it's really close to me around that 70 to 75 mark. So I would probably estimate that it's around 70 millimeters of precipitation for Makindu. How does climate relate to organisms that live in an area? The amount of precipitation or water an area receives will determine the number and the wide variety of different organisms that live in an area. So the temperature of an area will determine the growing season and biodiversity of plant life. The more producers, remember our vocabulary words from earlier in the year, the producers are plants, so the more plant life you have in an area, the more consumers, or the things that eat those plants or that eat other consumers, the more of those there will be. So you'll have more biodiversity, a wide variety of plants and animals in an area. Moderate climates will have more plants and animals, while extreme climates will have far less. It's just difficult for plants and animals to live in areas where there are extreme climates. Let's look at our climograph here. We're going to review and remember what we learned about climographs earlier this year. Climographs have two main features that they're data sets that they're keeping track of: temperature and precipitation. The first thing is, what do you notice about the temperature in Cairo? If I look at the red line graph here, which is showing us our temperature, I see that our low values are around 15 degrees Celsius, with our values rising throughout the summer months up to close to 30 degrees Celsius in the summer, and then lowering again when we get towards the winter months. So when I see that, and my big point of reference that I really ask students to memorize is the freezing point of water. And I have them remember that the freezing point of water is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also equivalent to 0 degrees Celsius. So you see that none of the data points for temperature come anywhere near that freezing point. And so we notice that our temperatures are warm to hot. I put a little reference table down here for you if that helps you to understand or have an idea of Celsius versus Fahrenheit, and then millimeters versus inches, since we tend to use Fahrenheit and inches here in the United States. There is not a one-to-one relationship in those two scales, meaning when you increase Fahrenheit by 1 degree, Celsius does not increase by 1 degree. And also, same thing with inches. If you increase inches by one, then you don't also increase millimeters by 1. So you can see I gave you some information here that hopefully will help you keep an idea of just some general ranges so that you can make estimates from there. Additionally, I included this thermometer for you so that you can keep track of the Fahrenheit versus Celsius. Precipitation. What describing words would you use to talk about the precipitation in Cairo? Really quickly, and this is the beauty of a climograph, I can look at the data points, and I can especially look at the precipitation. These blue bars, they're almost non-existent. So the main describing word that comes into my mind is dry. These bars are very, very low. And really, we've got, that would probably be a midpoint of 50. This axis interval line here would be probably at 25. So we're way below, like close to 0 on almost all of these. The bars are non-existent here in the summer months, which would make it really miserable if you're a plant or an animal. So lastly, what types of biotic organisms would you expect to find in Cairo? You're going to find plants and animals that have adapted to living in those extreme temperatures, so very warm temperatures, and also that can store water in their bodies or have adaptations or behaviors that will allow what little water there is, even in the form of dew or so on, to be channeled towards their roots or for them to have available for drinking if you're an animal. So for our review activity, I want you to imagine that you'll be moving to one of the following biomes for the coming school year. We're just making this up, but it helps us to do the activity. So we're just going to imagine if we move somewhere else for a year. So I want you to choose one of the three climograph locations below to use for the activity. I'll give you just a moment to look at those three. You will need to decide if you want to choose Bangkok, Thailand, Cairo, Egypt, Gotthard, Greenland. Now that you've chosen one of those locations, you're going to additionally use this table for your activity. You see that I put the three locations there, and I also included the biome types for you. I wrote describing words or adjectives to tell us about the temperature and the precipitation of those biomes. I also added plants and animal columns in case you have forgotten some of the specifics about what we learned earlier this year when we studied biomes. If you see to the right two columns, I put plus signs, and those plus signs just mean that there are too many others to list. So I have listed you some specific plants and animals, and additionally some general categories of plants and animals for each of these. For example, orchids and ferns, those are specifics, and hopefully you will know how to draw those if you want to include those on your artwork. But there's layers of trees and vines and mosses, and those are more generalized. So our review activity, what we're going to be doing is based on the location you've chosen, one of those three climographs. I want you to think about the data and study the data in the climograph. What type of climate would this location have? What types of living organisms would you find there? Number 2, imagine how things would be similar or different if you moved to that biome. Number 3, on a blank sheet of paper, and you can just use notebook paper, you can use scrap paper, typing paper, construction paper, whatever, art paper if you have real artist drawing paper, I love that. But whatever you have at home that's convenient, I want you to draw a picture of yourself in the biome that you've chosen with the climate that's shown in the climograph. And you'll use additionally the criteria that I've listed below to include in your picture. So number 4, include the following in the drawing of yourself in the biome you picked. I want to also mention this activity is not as much about making sure that you're a great artist, although you may be. And I really enjoy when my students draw these unbelievable works of art. I happen not to be a great artist myself. I wish I was, but I'm not, and I often have to draw stick figures. So if you need to draw a stick figure of yourself, that is no problem. You just do your best. So we're back to number 4, and we're on A. Draw yourself wearing appropriate clothing for the climate in your biome that you've chosen. B, draw at least 6 biotic, living or once living factors you would find in that biome or climate. Label each factor. C, draw at least 4 abiotic, non-living factors you would find in that biome or climate. Label each factor, please. And I put a special note here, and I even put it in a different color. The abiotic elements for the above biomes are not listed in the table. Remember, you'll need to put items such as water, air, sunshine, temperature, minerals, clouds, all those different abiotic elements into your drawing. D, draw what you think your house might look like. How would it be different from the place you live in now? And maybe it's not a house, maybe it's an apartment, or maybe it's some type of tent, who knows. Label at least 3 features that would be appropriate for, let's call it a dwelling in that biome climate. E, draw yourself doing an outdoor activity that's appropriate for the climate. So for example, if you chose the biome that has very cold temperatures and there might be lots of snow there, then you might think about drawing yourself snowboarding or skiing or sledding. Fill up your entire paper so that there is very little blank space. And G, color your drawing if you have crayons, markers, or colored pencils available. So I gave some additional activity extensions in case you're interested in stretching yourself a little further if this is a topic that you're wanting to continue to dive deeper into. You may write your answers on a piece of notebook paper or even the back of your drawing. Number one, what are the positive benefits of living in the new climate or biome that you chose? What might be some negative consequences of living in the new climate or biome that you've chosen? Try to list at least 4 of each. Number two, how would the outdoor activities you normally do at home be similar or different to the new climate you selected? What change in clothing would you need to wear in the new biome that will be different from what you have now? 4, what are the major differences in abiotic and biotic factors in your chosen biome or climate as compared to where you live now? Would that matter to you? Why or why not? 5, think about the feeding relationships and biomes that we learned about earlier this year. Draw a food web with at least 6 organisms for the biome/climate you selected. Be sure to properly label the organisms and draw the arrows in the correct direction for all feeding relationships. 6, use what you learned this year about renewable resources such as solar energy, wind power, biomass, hydroelectric power, and others to answer the following questions. What possible renewable resource or resources could you use in the new biome/climate you selected? List at least 3 reasons the renewable resource would work well in the biome climate, and list any problems you can think of that could be caused by the renewable resource in the biome climate you chose. I hope that you will share what you've learned today by tweeting at KCS Science. And I also hope that you have a better understanding of how to analyze climate data using climographs and to see how climate relates to biotic and abiotic factors in different land biomes. Thank you so much for joining me today for 6th grade science, week 4, lesson 1, where we reviewed climograph data and analyzed how the climate of an area affects the biotic and abiotic factors in that area or biome. Remember that you can find all of the activities on the KCS website under the Student Resources tab. Printed copies of this material is available on a weekly basis at the meal distribution sites on Wednesdays from 10 to noon. Thank you again for joining me in this review, and we'll see you next week. Stay well.